Hello, and welcome to Public Health in Action. It's a new series from the Harvard Chan Studio and Harvard Public Health Magazine, spotlighting public health programs that work. I'm Gina Morin-Garambe, the managing editor of Harvard Public Health, and your moderator today. Today, we're continuing our five-part series on mental health as we talk about working on womanhood, or WOW, a school-based counseling program that supports Black and Latina girls who've been exposed to trauma. Our panel today will give us an inside look at WOW, and we'll also examine the research on the WOW program and talk about how lessons learned in WOW can be brought to other communities. So joining me today are Monica Bott, the Senior Research Director at the University of Chicago Education Lab, Ngozi Abandi-Harris, the WOW Director of Program and Staff Development at Youth Guidance, which is the nonprofit that's home to the program, and Bansuri Pandit, a WOW program alum. Thank you all for being with us today. We're really looking forward to this conversation. Maybe to get us started, would each of you briefly describe how you describe WOW to someone who doesn't know anything about the program? And maybe if there's one key point you want our audience to have in mind as we get this conversation started.
Sure, I'll kick us off. One of the first things that I tell people when I'm describing WOW is that it's a space where young people come together with adults that are very intentional about their training and intentional about how they show up for young people in the school setting. And they're creating a group setting where they get to talk about issues that they don't typically get to talk about. And in that space, young people are learning from each other, they're learning from that adult, and they're really getting the opportunity to understand what does it mean to own their narrative, with getting the skills to navigate through a world that isn't necessarily set up for them to be owners of their narrative. And so it's really about that relationship that is created with that counselor, with the young people that are in the room, and just coming together and having the much needed conversations.
In addition to what Ngozi just said, I describe WOW as being a school-based, once a week, group-based mentoring and counseling program that has a very strong curriculum, and that curriculum is rooted in cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance commitment therapy, and narrative therapy. And so there are 5 different modules where the girls work on things like healthy relationships, self-esteem with their sort of clinically trained counselor in what would normally be an elective class or set aside time once a week during school, which is really a unique model.
From my perspective as an alumni of WOW program, I think it's a program that provides support, mentorship, and opportunity for personal and academic growth. It also includes like fun activities, workshop resources that can actually help young girls build essential life skills.
Terrific. Thank you all so much. So there's a lot going on in WOW, clearly. Maybe we can zoom in on kind of a typical WOW session. Ngozi, can you walk us through what happens in the room that makes the experience so impactful for the participants?
Absolutely. And I think it's can be seen in the unique way that each of us describe WOW, that all of those things are coming together in that session. And it happens before you even get to the room, you get to day one of the curriculum. It's the fact that we are embedded in the school. So that WOW counselor, you will see them in the hallway. You'll see them interacting with the teachers and the school staff. And that's all before we get to that session, that once a week session where they're talking about starting with self-awareness and really understanding who they are, what their values are, but then getting in deeper into what are relationships and how am I entering into those relationships, and how am I making sure that my values and my needs and my wants are being met in those relationships. And so it's really about that counselor being available to remind the young person about the different conversations that they're having, but it's also about that space that gets created when we have those really good school partners that give us dedicated space where we can decorate it and make it truly a safe haven in that school. Young people are coming in and they're having those conversations with that WOW counselor, with other young people who may approach the world completely different. We have young people who are very much, they're out there, they're extroverts, they're loud and proud. We have young people who are quiet, and all of them are coming together and they're learning a little bit more about each other, learning how to take up space, how to not to pull back and let others take up space. All of that is going on, and you have that WOW counselor that's just bringing it all together so that young people are able to just really get the skills that they need to be their authentic self in this world.
Pretty amazing. Thank you, Ngozi. Mansouri, maybe from your experience, take us back to that first moment you walked into a WOW classroom for the first time. Did you know what to expect? Were you nervous at all?
Yeah, so my first encounter with WOW was at the age of 17, which was my third year in the United States. So everything was relatively new to me. And in that session, like I saw other girls from my classes whom I never spoke with. So definitely made me very nervous. I had no expectations whatsoever. I just thought it was another class in my schedule. And on the very first session, my counselor started doing like icebreakers and going over the overview of the program. And over the course of all these sessions, I realized how this is a safe space to share my experience and a place where I will not be judged. And to recognize that commonalities with other classmates was very crucial at my age. And especially coming from an immigrant family where mental health is not a priority whatsoever, I feel like WOW provided that comfortable space for me where I can talk about things I normally wouldn't talk about at home.
Oh, that sounds really impactful. Thanks for sharing that. Um, Monica, for a different look at this classroom space and this work, you've been studying WOW and its effectiveness from the beginning of the program, if I'm correct. Can you share with us a little bit about how the program got started and how common it is for young people to be exposed to trauma, and how the program and y'all went about looking at the different ways that expresses itself among girls in particular?
Sure. So we have had a longstanding partnership with Youth Guidance, the nonprofit organization in which WOW is housed since 2008, where we studied a program for young boys. It was a group-based mentoring and counseling program called Becoming a Man. And so we had a long history of working together, both with Youth Guidance, but also with Chicago Public Schools and the city of Chicago. And so in 2016, in part based on the weight of that evidence, the city of Chicago, under then Mayor Rahm Emanuel, decided to expand mentoring services for all 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th grade boys in communities that were experiencing high rates of gun violence all across the city. So this was going to serve thousands of young boys with mentoring and counseling services, not just with Youth Guidance, but also across 57 mentoring agencies across the city. It was a really I think, laudable effort to scale up evidence-based practice, but it was all focused on boys. And of course, there was a contingency of advocates who said, well, what about girls? We have this program, and the WOW program is different from the Becoming a Man program, and they had been working with Dr. Rebecca Ford Paz on doing some formative assessments, on really strengthening their curriculum, some community-based participatory research to think about who they were serving and why. So there was an intentionality behind the program that was sort of perfectly timed in terms of its maturity to then go to the next phase of wanting to be studied. There was also pressure on the city to expand mentoring and counseling services for young women as well. And so the confluence of these things kind of came together in what I think of as like a true Chicago partnership. Chicago has a lot of sort of civic and philanthropic and sort of strong, it just has a very strong social sector. And so this partnership was between the city of Chicago, which made available 750 additional spots through philanthropic and city funding for girls to be part of this mayor's mentoring initiative. The anchor partner there was going to be the WOW program, who was going to deliver the programming for these 750 young women. And then Chicago Public Schools were going to help sort of recruit and make sure that their schools were a part of this. And we were brought in to be the evaluation partner because we knew that there were way more girls who could benefit from services, or that was what we suspected, at least, that there were way more girls who could benefit from services than just 750. And so we stood up the partnership. We identified 10 neighborhood high schools all across the city, the south side, the west side, and the northwest side. And in there, we identified 3,500 young girls, almost every single ninth, 10th, and 11th grader who could benefit from WOW programming. And we randomly assigned some of the girls to receive WOW programming, and then the other girls to receive all other status quo services that were there. And this allowed us to then study outcomes sort of at the end of programming to understand what the effects were in a way that we could isolate the program effect. But when we set out to design the study, we actually didn't have a very good sense of sort of what the baseline rates were of the three outcomes that the WOW program and Ngozi and her team had sort of said, we know that we're affecting these outcomes. It was PTSD, anxiety, and depression. And they were very clear because they had done some of this earlier work on strengthening the curriculum that those were the three outcomes that they cared about. So we did a baseline survey of about 350 girls in the fall of 2017. Some of the girls were assigned to WOW, some of the girls weren't. And we, this was before any programming took place. And what we found was really striking, particularly on the dimension of PTSD, where we found that 38% of girls had probable or likely PTSD and PTSD symptoms, which on the same measure was twice that of Iraq and Afghani war veterans who were sort of coming back from combat. And again, so you sort of think about who the eligible pool here, this is the average 9th, 10th, and 11th grade girl. So unlike prior studies we had done in this sort of partnership focused on young boys, where we saw lots of externalizing behaviors, involvement in the criminal legal system, misconducts at school, absences, we actually saw that despite this incredibly high level of PTSD among these young girls, which is just like the average young girl who's in these neighborhood high schools, they had a B average. They were coming to school, almost 90% of the time. And we didn't see a lot of those externalizing behaviors. But the rate of PTSD and probable PTSD was so staggeringly high due to just incredible levels of trauma exposure, which I'm happy to talk about, that we knew that we really needed to understand whether this program or other programs could mitigate the harms of trauma, which we know can, have really consequential effects later in life. So we set it up as a randomized control trial, and then we set out to study the effects with Ngozi and our team.
Wow. Yeah, that statistic is staggering, that just your average high school girl having almost or double the rate of PTSD as returning service members, which makes one piece of the program makes clear the crucial nature of one piece of the program, the way that it's trauma informed. And Ngozi, I know that's a big focus for you. Can you tell us a little bit about what exactly that means to have a trauma-informed counseling program and why it's so important?
It means a couple of things. I think the most important thing that it means is that we are hiring people who understand that trauma is impacting the lives of so many people in so many different ways. And so all of our counselors are coming in with that understanding of what is trauma. We talk about the big T's and the little T's, understanding that just because you wouldn't necessarily consider it a trauma doesn't mean that it's not overwhelming the resources that a young person has. And that means that you should be ready for their trauma responses to look and feel different from yours, and that being okay. We are constantly doing trainings where we're looking at what's the most recent research on trauma's impact on the brain development, how particularly for Black girls in our schools, that for a little while there, because there was no understanding around trauma, that they were being labeled as not being girls, and they were loud and they were fighting more. And helping to create that understanding that that's still a trauma response. That's that girl perceiving a threat, no matter what's going on in the environment, there's still a perceived threat, and they're reacting to it. They're trying to stay alive. They're trying to stay safe, and so that means that our staff, everyone in that environment has to be prepared to support that young person and understanding that although you are perceiving a threat, what are other ways that you can assess that threat? What are other ways that you can have a different reaction? What are the different choices that you get to make? And how do you want to show up in this world? And it takes a lot of just being able to build rapport, not judging, not saying, oh, you shouldn't have did that, you shouldn't have gotten in that fight, but really understanding like, okay, now that you are out of that moment, let's talk about what happened. Let's talk about how you want to show up, but not trying to address that when they're in the heat of that fight, because that's where they're in survival mode. They're not trying to understand like what's going on. So we're trying to get to them after and hopefully before, so that they can take that pause, so that they can walk away, so that they can reach out to other trusted adults. They can have more help-seeking behaviors that will help them make different decisions. But it's really understanding all of that and making sure that the space that you're creating, the relationship that you're creating, is safe for that young person to make as many mistakes as they need to and continue to know that. And you can continue to get up. You can continue to make a different decision. You can get some more information and make a different decision.
And I know that there's a really careful, very intentional approach to connecting with, for counselors to connecting with girls through lived experience as well. Can you unpack for us a little bit how counselors are able to use their lived experience to help alleviate social isolation or to build trust?
Yeah. So one of the things that we intentionally do within WOW is, one, starting with the hiring process, understanding why our counselors, why our candidates are coming in to do this work. And most of the time they're saying, I want to be that person that I didn't have when I was growing up. And so that lets us know that there's a universality of needing adults, particularly women of color, who are sharing that experience with them, that are know what it's like to make that mistake and have someone not put them down for making that mistake, not put them down for whatever life choices that they're making, and help them to see that it, I'll give the example of, I had a student who was always picking the fight. Like, she was the person that was picking the fight, right? And as she was trying to make change, no one was, the teachers, the school staff wasn't necessarily ready to see her changing and shifting. And some of the work that we did was just her knowing, like, yeah, I've been there. I may not have been the aggressive fighter, the starter, but I've been there with some of the decisions that I've made, and everybody not being quite ready for me to make those different decisions. And you hear our girls saying that over and over again, that it is those share, when we intentionally share how we've overcome something, when I talk about my anxiety and like how nervous I get when I do trainings and presentations, and them understanding like, yeah, I'm sitting there taking deep breaths. I'm sitting there being intentional about like, okay, what am I going to say? Am I saying it correctly? And how sometimes that got misinterpreted. Me sharing those intentional experiences to help them grow, help them understand what this could look like for them, is so powerful, because they feel connected. They don't feel like, oh, I'm the only one that's going through that, because so often that's what it feels like. I just recently shared a story of how I felt like growing up, where before I got glasses, I thought the whole world saw everything the same way. And when I realized that there's support, there's other people out there that understands what it means to like be in the back of the classroom trying to just, be, and still can't see the board and not wanting to say anything, and knowing how to raise your hand and say like, I can't, I legit can't see the board, and like how powerful that experience is. That's what we want to give to our young people. That's what sharing our lived experiences does. It helps them to see like, no, the whole world doesn't see it that way. And here we all can come together and um, you don't have to be alone. You can have the chance to connect with other people who are learning to see the world and be connected.
That's really beautiful. Um, Bansuri, maybe I saw you kind of nodding along to some of what Ngozi was saying, and maybe you could share with us a little bit about your relationship with the WOW counselor in your program, and what did you learn from that person, and how has that relationship changed over time?
Yeah, so I've always been a very guarded person, especially in those teenage years. Um, and with my counselor, I started getting comfortable by sharing my whole experience about me moving from a different country and then the feelings I was experiencing. And I was nervous and anxious. And just like how Gozi said, like my counselor shared that similar experience about her being an immigrant. So I found that common ground with her. And, she told me it was totally common and it's okay to feel scared and anxious. And she will just walk me through how to deal with these. So, which made me very comfortable. And I started going to my WOW classrooms more often. And I want to emphasize how she always had an open door policy, which means that girls can come whenever they would like. If they have something to talk about or if they just want to catch up and just tell them like what's new, what's going on, how our class is going, how the performance is. So which I've did in my teenage years. So my counselor has seen me grow up from a teenager to an adult, and I can actually see how much progress I've made when it comes to dealing with my feelings.
Wow, that must feel really good. That's great. Is there a moment, if you think back on your whole experience with WOW, is there a moment that stands out to you in particular, for when you used the tools or felt like you really needed to call upon what you learned in the program to get through a particular challenge you were facing or a decision you needed to make?
Yeah, actually, there's so many times, but I will share one. So after graduating high school, there were a lot of times where I found myself in like uncomfortable position, especially in college and work, and like English being my second language. It was very hard for me to cope with those feelings of like anxiety and nervousness. And the Bantry without the WOW experience would immediately remove herself from that situation. And by having those techniques and tools to learn, I realized that that is where growth happens the most. And this is actually the line my counselor said, which just stuck out with me even after all these years. Like you grow in uncomfortable situation, and in those times, I managed to control my feelings and see things from a different perspective. So I did use it very much.
Wow, that's great. I've had the chance to meet all of you and talk with you a little bit before, but I'm still like furiously scribbling down notes as you're speaking. There's so much gold in what you're saying. Thank you. Monica, from the research that you've done, is the experience that Bansuri described typical? How do you see the impact of WOW on a sort of more aggregate scale?
Yeah, and I should say, Monsari, it's so amazing to hear you sort of talk about this WOW experience. I've had the privilege of sitting in a few WOW sessions, and in particular, there's like a mirror exercise where you hold the mirror up to yourself. And I was like a researcher sitting in, but it was a really powerful. This was many years ago, but I still remember that session now, and I think as you were talking, I was just reflecting on the fact that like so many adults could use this kind of programming because we all have emotions and dealing with them in healthy ways is just such a profoundly um, mature skill. So I just really commend you on being able to articulate what you've learned and reflect on when you might have used it. I think that's really remarkable um, to do at such a young age or like really at any age. So I think my job as a researcher is to take stories like the one that Bansari just said and, you know, turn them into data points and aggregate them up so that we have a sense of what would happen if girls, don't get WOW programming. I love the way you frame that, like the Bansari without WOW programming, because that's exactly the way that we think about it is how can we isolate the effect of WOW programming? So what would happen if girls didn't have WOW programming? What happens with WOW programming? So I mentioned that we assigned girls, 3,500 girls, almost every single 9th, 10th, and 11th grader in these 10 neighborhood high schools to either receive WOW programming or receive all other status quo services that existed in a school. And at the end of the year, so in the spring of 2018, we did a survey to try to assess girls on outcomes such as PTSD symptoms, anxiety, and depression. And the reason that we did this survey is because these kinds of outcomes are incredibly important and they're not captured in sort of traditional or typical data systems. And so we raised and spent millions of dollars to be able to go out and ask girls and in a sort of careful and sensitive way in school environments, what their experiences were on a host of things, but particularly on those three outcomes. We surveyed about 2,000 girls, about half or so of whom had gotten the WOW programming, the 750 girls, and then the other girls who had all status quo services. And what we saw was a 22% reduction for girls who had been participated in WOW services. We saw a 22% reduction in PTSD symptoms. And then we saw a 10% and 14% reduction in anxiety and depression as well. And that's really remarkable because if you think about the kinds of experiences that girls had sort of prior and the kinds of trauma that they were exposed to, I don't know that we systematically know of programming where we've done a rigorous study at this sort of modest scale where we can say this program, when deployed, systematically reduces these kinds of symptoms in girls. And so Bansari's sort of anecdotal evidence and her personal experience is not unique. And I think that's really heartening for policymakers because we have no shortage of boutique programs that might be able to support students or girls on smaller scale, but what we need is sort of systematically generated evidence so that we can point to this to say, here's an approach that you can take. It's not impossible. All hope is not lost, and we've got kind of a path forward. And I will say that this is just one study. And so my hope is that we have just a lot more studies of this nature and of this ilk to show what other kinds of approaches might be helpful at reducing PTSD, anxiety, and depression. But I think it's enormously heartening to know that this is not sort of a one-off. This is not idiosyncratic, but it's something that is carefully thought out. It's systematically done. And it is this process of being in fellowship with your sort of community of WOW girls and your counselor and building these skills. I think the reason that we see these impressive effects that are statistically significant is one hypothesis is that there's a lot of skill building. Like you heard the kind of coping mechanisms and the skill building. So it's not just hypothetical, it's sort of applying these approaches to what you can actually do and use in your life and forming that habit by consistent reinforcement. And that's really, I think, part of what the secret sauce is.
That's terrific. And it's a secret sauce that is spreading too. WOW started in Chicago, but now there are programs in Boston, in Dallas, in Kansas City. Currently, WOW is serving, if I'm up to date, 2,600 students, which is incredible. And I know, Ngozi, you're always getting requests about bringing WOW to new places. What advice would you give to people who are listening who want to see or start a similar program where they are? WOW can't be everywhere, but there's some things you might have been able to distill and to share that can help those who want to take action after having heard this program, and the powerful evidence, data, and anecdotal that there is for the success of WOW. So Ngozi, what advice might you share with those folks?
I would definitely share that there is a need for adults that really understand what it means to work alongside young people. There's also a need for adults to be willing to pull everything together to support young people. So that is the clinical. You've heard us talk about WOW from that it's acceptance and commitment therapy. It's cognitive behavior therapy and narrative therapy. But our young people, while we will use some of that language, we don't necessarily say you're in therapy, you're in group counseling. But it's definitely giving them that chance to see that. And that's, it's also not a bad thing to go to counseling. And you need adults that can be able to navigate through the experience of, yes, counseling helps and it supports, and know how to bring it to a young person in a way that they will hear it, they will understand it, and they will be able to attend to it, and want to seek it out and not feel stigmatized by being a part of it. So what I would recommend for other cities to, one, yes, reach out. We would love to come to your city, but also to find those unique adults that know how to blend it all together to work with young people and find out what are the things that work, what are those best practices that work, so that young people get the best possible best practices that are available to them to help them with trauma, to help them with the different things that are going on for them.
That's great. I love the way you put that, find those unique adults. It's you outlined such a powerful universal need, but also a universal resource that our communities have these people if we look for and know how to tap them. That's a really powerful takeaway. Monica, what's your takeaway for folks today?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and build off of what Ngozi was saying, which is we did the survey work where we asked girls, about a host of questions, and one of them was about their access to a caring adult. And lots of the girls said that they had access to caring adults, but and I don't know, Bonsari, if this sort of echoes your experience as well, but the girls sort of said, we don't have adults that we talk about this kind of stuff with. And it's being able to talk about these topics about self-esteem, identity, these behavioral coping strategies that really seems to be the difference, because I think sometimes we talk about mentoring programs and say, oh, all kids need is access to a caring adult, but it's a caring adult and one that you can work and learn these skills from, work on these skills, practice these skills from in a safe space. And I think sometimes that second distinction is lost. So I think my key takeaway is one, we really need to pay attention to girls' mental health and I think that there's growing recognition that this is a crisis for all adolescents, not just girls, but that girls might have a unique set of circumstances that need addressing with unique curriculum. And so we need to pay attention to it. I sort of had that prior, but I still was so astounded by the incredibly high rates of PTSD that we found, again, in the sort of average high school girl. And this was prior to the pandemic. And we know since then those rates have skyrocketed. But then, two, I think my other takeaway is that all hope is not lost. We do have approaches, rooted in these various kinds of therapies that can be done in cost-effective ways in partnership with our school systems, as an example, to reach girls and to really mitigate the harms of the really high rates of trauma exposure that we see for adolescent girls. And so we should both try to reduce the trauma exposure in and of itself, but then also deploy these strategies so that if there is sort of high exposure to things like gun violence or loss of a loved one, or other forms of sort of community or interpersonal violence, there is a strategy to sort of mitigate those harms. And I think that we should really build off of the momentum of this study to learn more.
Right. Bansuri, we're going to give you the last word today. What's the key takeaway you want folks to have in mind as we depart our discussion?
Yeah, so I just want to say WoW has been like such an unforgettable experience for me. I grew up so much as a person throughout those 4 years, and even now I continue to maintain that same relationship with my counselor after all these years. And all the valuable things I've learned regarding self-awareness, leadership, maintaining healthy relationship with myself, especially, and everybody around me. So I truly, truly, truly wish that every young female gets to experience this and have the same experience as me and grow and do amazing things.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Thank you all for being here with us today, Bansuri, Monica, and Ngozi. It's been a terrific conversation, really thought-provoking, and really inspiring. So thank you for making the time and sharing with our viewers. This is part of the Public Health in Action series, and if you want to learn more about that series or about WOW, you can visit hsph.me/action. That's Harvard School of Public Health, hsph.me, like yourself, /action. Thank you all again.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.